So if you're here to hear about Honest Abe, well, then boy do I have an episode for you. Hey there, welcome to the show where we attempt to depose historical myths and legends by reenacting them in real time with real people. And today, we are looking at the fairy tale biography of Abraham Lincoln. That's right, today we are going to look at his life from birth to death and try and figure out which parts of it are true and which ones are myth. So like always, let's start at the beginning. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809 in a log cabin in Hodgenville, Kentucky. This part is true. The cabin itself is still around and can be visited today, though its exact location is a bit of a mystery. Some believe this is the actual site, while others say that it was moved here in 1916 from its original location down the hill. Though Abraham was born in Kentucky, his family didn't stay there for long. When he was just 7 years old, they packed up and headed to Indiana. Now, the reasons for this move vary depending on who you ask. Some historians believe that Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, killed a man in self-defense in Kentucky, and that this is what prompted the move. But there is little evidence to support this theory. Others think the family just wanted some cheap land that had been set aside for veterans of the Revolutionary War. It was around this time that Thomas received a plot of 200 acres in what would become the town of Petersburg, Indiana. Whatever the reason, the family left Kentucky and settled into their new home in Indiana. This is another place you can visit today. In fact, you can see both the Lincoln Boyhood National Monument and the Lincoln Pioneer Farm in Indiana. But if you want to go see where he grew up, you actually need to head over to Illinois. You see, when Abraham was 14, his family moved again, this time to New Salem, Illinois. By this point, Abraham had already taught himself how to read and write, despite his father's wishes that he not receive much of an education. Apparently, Thomas thought schooling was a waste of time and that practical skills like farming were far more important. Well, I guess in a way he did have a point. I mean, farming is pretty practical. But luckily for young Abraham, his mother was on his side and would wake up before sunrise to teach him his lessons. In New Salem, Abraham worked as a storekeeper for a man named Denton Offutt. Though things were going well for him there, he would soon have to leave after getting involved in a political fight. The New Salem store was a popular stop for local politicians stumping for votes, and Abraham found himself getting drawn into the debates. When one politician, a man named John Dawson, accused Abraham of stealing his horse, Abraham called him a liar. The two men almost got into a fist fight, but eventually decided to settle their differences with a boxing match instead. To this day, no one knows whether Dawson or Lincoln won, since the only accounts of the fight come from each man's friends, who, of course, claimed that their guy had knocked the other one out. But I personally find it hard to believe that either man would have been willing to admit defeat, even if they lost. So I say it was a draw and we should all agree to call it a draw. Now, after this fight, Abraham knew that things in New Salem weren't gonna be the same. So he packed up and headed north to New Haven, Illinois. There he began working as a postmaster and started studying law. He also met and fell in love with a woman named Mary Todd, who lived nearby in Springfield. The two began writing letters to each other, and after a brief period of courtship, Mary agreed to marry him. They exchanged vows on November 4, 1831, and the two returned to Springfield, where they raised 4 sons together. Abraham's career as a lawyer was going well, and soon he was getting requests to argue cases all across the state. During this time, he adopted the nickname Honest Abe, thanks to his reputation for honesty and integrity. However, Honest Abe was about to enter a case that put his name on the line. One day, Abraham was hired to represent a group of squatters whose cabins had been destroyed by a sheriff trying to reclaim the land for its owner. Naturally, he took their side and argued that destroying their homes without giving them time to gather their belongings was cruel and inhumane. His client's case was successful, but word spread that Abraham had made a lot of money off the settlement. Some people were suspicious that Abraham had somehow tricked the court and decided to investigate. They combed through the records of the case, but couldn't find any evidence of foul play. Eventually, they asked Abraham directly if he had done anything dishonest, and he answered no, so people accepted that Honest Abe really was honest. And because of his strong reputation, Abraham was elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834. He served there for 4 years and during that time gained enough popularity to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. He won the election and began his first term in 1847. Unfortunately, his time in Congress was overshadowed by his opposition to the Mexican War. He felt that the war wasn't right and tried to get funding cut to the military. When the measure failed, he resigned from Congress and returned to Illinois. During this time, Abraham was offered the position of Attorney General under President James K. Polk, but he turned it down, feeling that he couldn't accept a government job while also criticizing the government. Instead, he went back to being a lawyer, which was probably good news for him anyway, since he was making more money than he ever had in Congress. Well, then in 1858, Abraham threw his hat into the ring for a seat in the Senate. He campaigned against a man named Stephen Douglas, who supported the popular idea of popular sovereignty. Basically, this idea stated that slavery should be allowed wherever it's wanted by the people. Abraham, of course, was against this and said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Though the election went to Douglas, Lincoln gained enough popularity during the campaign to attract national attention. Before long, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as the presidential candidate in 1860. The other candidates were all pro-slavery, and most people believed that he didn't stand a chance. However, the results shocked everyone. Lincoln won the majority of electoral votes, though he only received 40% of the total vote. The other 60% was split between the 3 pro-slavery candidates. Upon hearing this news, people in the South felt threatened, and 7 states quickly seceded from the Union. Soon after, 4 more states would follow, creating the Confederate States of America. And when Virginia seceded, President Buchanan sent Abraham Lincoln a letter asking him to use his power to keep peace in the nation. But Lincoln refused, saying that it wasn't his duty to preserve the Union, but rather his duty to preserve the principles upon which the Union was founded. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the next day, Lincoln declared that the United States was once again engaged in a war for the preservation of the Union. Over the next 4 years, Abraham Lincoln would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, giving formerly enslaved people in Confederate territory the right to join the Union Army. He gave his famous Gettysburg Address and won the war, which ended with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Sadly, Lincoln's victory was short-lived. On April 15, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He was taken to a house nearby, where he died the following morning. And now we have reached the end of Honest Abe's life. So which parts of it were true and which ones were myth? Honestly, it's a little difficult to say. You see, there's a ton of information out there on Abraham Lincoln, and much of it is contradictory. For example, some sources say he was born in a log cabin, while others say he wasn't. Likewise, many people claim he walked to New Salem after his family moved to Illinois, but there is no evidence to support this story. As for the rest of his life, there's plenty of stories that I didn't even include today, like the time he wrestled a bear or saved a pig from drowning. But unfortunately, it's hard to verify these claims. It's safe to say that some of them are true and others are false, and some may even be based on exaggerated truths. For example, we know that Abraham was very good at public speaking, but was he really as good as they say? Was he actually able to convince an entire courtroom full of men that an ape was a donkey? Probably not. But maybe he was able to convince a few people that a hog wasn't a wolf. Regardless, we will never know which stories are true and which ones are false. And that means that the real Honest Abe may have gotten a little mythologized over time. But if you don't mind me saying, it is kind of nice to have a hero who isn't quite as perfect as the stories say. After all, if he was completely perfect, we wouldn't be able to relate to him as easily. That's all for this episode. Let us know your thoughts on Abraham Lincoln and be sure to like, share, subscribe and comment. Also check out our second channel. We'll see you next time.